Welcome, everyone. My name is William Milberg. I'm the Dean of the New School for Social Research. Welcome to the New School in this beautiful church. The New School for Social Research is our graduate school of social sciences, philosophy, history. So I want to welcome you to the New School and welcome you to the keynote address for our exciting conference on loyalty and betrayal, their role in political life. The conference is sponsored by the New School's Center for Public Scholarship and the tremendous program over 2 days. This is a must event that we're here for tonight. All the responsibility of the director of the Center for Public Scholarship, Arian Mack. Professor Mack, I will add, is remarkable and also the founder of our recently created new University in Exile Consortium, which has connected us again to the campaign to support scholars from around the world whose academic freedom has been severely curtailed or destroyed by authoritarian politics or by civil war. The consortium, the new University in Exile Consortium, serves as a hub for U.S. colleges and universities who host scholars from Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and elsewhere who are severely challenged in their scholarly work by the political situation in their countries. The new University in Exile Consortium provides a forum for these scholars to share their scholarly work and their concerns as exiles with each other, with the world, through regular meetings and online discussions. And Arian and her colleagues have really done a remarkable work here, and they have brought the New School for Social Research back to really its original mission in 1933 as the University in Exile, which of course was then focused on Germany and the rise of fascism. At the New School for Social Research, we often point to this 1933 founding moment as our most important historical moment. And it was very significant as humanitarian, as a geopolitical gesture in response to the rise of the Nazi Party. But we celebrate this week the founding of the New School in 1919, 100 years ago, and in some ways, the 1919 founding moment was a more significant act in terms of education. It was a rejection of traditional structures of higher education and a search for a new relation between teachers and learners. The demand for loyalty, the theme of this conference, was central to that founding moment in 1919, as people mentioned this afternoon. Those Columbia University professors who came downtown to form a new school were not just fed up with academic hierarchy and the desire to reach a broader public audience with their scholarship and their teaching, they were openly protesting Columbia University's demand that faculty sign a loyalty oath to the U.S. position in World War I and to Columbia University's firing of 2 faculty members who opposed U.S. entry in the war. This was, of course, an important moment with respect to loyalty. It is at the founding of our own university. It's before the issues of loyalty are demanded in the McCarthy era, and it's, of course, before the loyalty demands of our own Trump era. So tonight, we turn to the current moment, and this conference is, as someone said this afternoon, unfortunately, remarkably timely. Authoritarian leaders throughout history have used the charge of treason and betrayal as a response to political opponents. And I'm reminded that this is the Festival of New, and it's posted everywhere, and we are the New School, and we celebrate the new. But in some ways, what the New School for Social Research does best is to take old, serious, important ideas, scrutinize them, canonical texts, read them, and revisit them for their relevance in the moment. And it seems to me the issues of loyalty and betrayal, nothing could be more relevant than in our current political moment. So we find ourselves today in a very challenging moment. Loyalty and betrayal have become precisely the terrain of a deep political divide in an era where a democratically elected government clamps down on its opponents or whistleblowers as treasonous. Showing support for an independent investigation of criminal collusion brings a firing and a possible indictment. This has quickly reverberated back to questions of the rule of law, the strength of democratic institutions, its system of checks and balances, and the very chilling prospect of a collapse into a new phase of American authoritarianism. Tonight, we are very lucky to have two key players in this unfolding drama to speak with us about how they see this issue playing out in our culture, in our politics, and in our capital city. And I'll take 1 minute to introduce them both. Andrew McCabe is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Threat: How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump. He spent 21 years in the FBI, began as a special agent in the FBI in 1996, assigned to the New York field office, investigating and supervising Russian organized crime cases. In 2006, Mr. McCabe shifted his focus to national security when he was promoted to FBI headquarters in the Counterterrorism Division. In 2009, he headed up the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, HIG, which was President Obama's effort to transform government interrogation around terrorism. In 2013, Mr. McCabe was appointed Executive Assistant Director of the National Security Branch, where he ensured the FBI successfully executed its mission to defend the U.S. from all national security threats. And in that role, he oversaw the FBI's work in counterterrorism, counterintelligence, intelligence, weapons of mass destruction, as well as the Terrorism Screening Center and the HIG. In December of 2014, it's a remarkable biography, Mr. McCabe was awarded the Presidential Rank for Meritorious Service. On May 9th, 2017, he became acting director of the FBI after the firing of FBI Director James Comey. And prior to that, Mr. McCabe served as deputy director, where he oversaw all of the FBI's operations and intelligence collection activities. Mr. McCabe himself, as you all know, was then fired from the FBI by Attorney General Jeff Sessions on March 16, 2018, 26 hours before Mr. McCabe was set for retirement and pension from the FBI. He had endorsed the establishment of a special counsel investigation in the Russian election meddling case in 2016, and he has claimed that his firing was politically motivated. Tonight, we will allow Mr. McCabe to come to the podium and give us a short speech, and then he will be interviewed by Carl Bernstein. Mr. Bernstein, everyone knows, of course, is the renowned journalist who, with Bob Woodward, broke the Watergate story for the Washington Post, leading to the resignation of President Nixon and setting the standard for modern investigative reporting, for which they and the Washington Post were awarded the Pulitzer Prize. With Woodward, Bernstein wrote two classic bestsellers, All the President's Men, we know the movie as well, and The Final Days, about the end of the Nixon presidency. I just learned before we got on stage here that he also has a book called Loyalties, a son's memoir about his parents in the McCarthy period, and we look forward to hearing about that as well. He's currently at work on several media projects, a memoir, an on-air political analyst for CNN, contributing editor for Vanity Fair, and his most recent book is A Woman in Charge, The Life of Hillary Rodham Clinton, which was a national bestseller. So let's get started. And we will now ask Mr. McCabe to deliver his speech. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be interviewed on stage by Carl Bernstein, and then Mr. Bernstein will moderate some question and answer session. Thank you all for being here, and please welcome Andrew McCabe to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, students, and all members of the New School community. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak to you here tonight. It is truly an honor to address a group as engaged and, quite frankly, as large. That's a bit terrifying for me, as you all are right now, but also to be able to do it on the 100th anniversary of the New School. So congratulations on your anniversary, and thank you for making me a part of it. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you a bit about loyalty and about how my experiences in the FBI showed me the majesty and the power of loyalty at its best, and the danger and manipulation of loyalty in pursuit of self-interest. The motto of the FBI is fidelity, bravery, and integrity. So it begins with fidelity. Fidelity, what is that? The quality or state of being faithful. And what is faithful? Well, according to Merriam-Webster, faithful is steadfast in affection or allegiance and loyal. So I think it's appropriate that at the FBI, you begin swearing an oath of loyalty to the concepts and the principles that we dedicate ourselves to during the course of our career. My beginning took place on a hot Sunday night in July of 1996. I had been suffering as a miserable attorney. Are there miserable attorneys in the audience? This is New York City, so I know there's some miserable attorneys in this audience. I feel you. Now, I was working, I'd really locked onto the idea of becoming an agent while I was in law school, but the FBI was under a hiring freeze. So when I graduated from law school, I went to work at a small firm in Camden, New Jersey. Wonderful town. And I immediately put my application in as soon as they started accepting them, and I waited and waited. And I remember most viscerally on April 19th, 1995, sitting in my office, the day that Timothy McVeigh drove a Ryder truck up to the front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. And he detonated that truck, killing 168 Americans and injuring about 500 others. And I spent the entire day sitting in my office, staring at the wall, listening to the radio. I did no work. I could not break away from the coverage of that event. There was something about what was happening on the ground. I couldn't explain it to myself that time, but I knew I wanted to be there. I just felt the need to be a part of that, to be in the rubble, the side of the smoking hole, helping those innocent people who had been touched so dreadfully by terrorism, and most importantly, being part of that team that was going to have the responsibility to find those people responsible and bringing them to justice. So I remember that time as being particularly tough, waiting for the FBI to give me the call. But I did get it eventually in July of 1996. And so on that Sunday night, packed up my stuff, drove down to Quantico, Virginia. And Quantico is a very regimented place. You are told exactly where to be at every minute of the day, and you must be early and don't be late and the whole nine yards. So as soon as we got there, we were told, you have half an hour to eat and then put on a suit and tie and report to the classroom, where we were sworn in as special agents in training in the FBI. Your very first night in the FBI, you don't sleep until you gather together with your class of 40 or so, and you hold up your right hand and take the following oath. You begin by saying, I, Andrew McCabe. Of course, you wouldn't say Andrew McCabe, you would say your own names. Just don't get hung up on that. Do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. And that is the phrase that gets me the most. Because everybody thinks about the first clause, the I will defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, which is striking and important and powerful. But it's the second clause that really defines what you do as an FBI agent. I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. to that same Constitution that binds us all to the principles of freedom, fairness, and justice. That is the source. That's what you become loyal to when you make that oath. Notably, there is no president in that oath. There is no political party in that oath. There is no race, there is no gender, there is no sexual orientation. It is simply the pledge of loyalty to the document that binds us together as Americans. It is the same oath that every public servant in the United States government takes. And with each of us, it carries the same meaning. Basically, that we will do our job, whatever it is, in accordance with the principles of that Constitution for the betterment of all Americans. I started to learn how this happens when I had the opportunity, my first office of assignment, right here in the Big Apple, New York City field office, not too far down Broadway from where we are sitting tonight. And I was first assigned there as an agent on the Russian Organized Crime Task Force. I know, ironic, right? Coincidence or not? Not sure. Not sure, but there I had the opportunity to work alongside other people who had taken the same oath as me, people who shared the same values and had dedicated themselves to those values in a visceral and day-to-day level. I also had the opportunity to work for leaders who showed me by example what it meant to be loyal to those concepts, to those ideals and those values. And I had the ability to interact with and help victims of crime who intrinsically knew that our loyalty to those concepts meant that we would help them, no matter who they were, or where they were from, or what their immigration status was, or anything else. So probably the best example I can give you of this is my first big case on my squad. So I was still very new in the New York office, new enough that I was showing up at work early, which no one in the New York office does. I was not seasoned enough to realize that our days dragged on into the evenings and it was better to come in a little bit later. But nevertheless, I was the only one there when the phone rang one morning. And on the phone, I hear this gravelly voice of a man with a heavy Russian accent who says to me, well, first, I had to introduce myself. I said, "Hello, McCabe, FBI." And then I giggled because I couldn't believe I was actually saying it. And the man on the other end said, "I think I am being racketeered." I was like, that's extraordinary. I never thought of that word as a verb, sort of in that way. But okay, let's go with it. So I talked to him, and he laid out a story for me. So Felix was a furniture store owner. He owned a store in Brooklyn. He was Russian. He was here on a green card, been here for many years. And he was part of a community of other furniture store owners, all Russian, hardworking people, not making a lot of money, but making their way in this country, paying taxes, living their lives in the same way that all of us do. Earlier in his career, he'd had a partner, a guy named Dmitry. And Dmitry left the store, went back to Russia, spent a year in Moscow, and then returned to Brooklyn with a new approach on life. Dmitry decided he'd become a gangster. And so he built around himself a small crew of thugs, and he set about doing what gangsters do, which is taking advantage of people in their own communities and extorting them for things like protection money and collection kidnappings and things like that. So Dmitry had come to Felix and said, "I'm going to get all the furniture store owners together, and they're all going to start paying me for protection. And I need you to help me with this. I need you to pull them all together." And Felix was outraged. He was nervous because he had a family and children. Dmitry knew them well and where he lived. But he was outraged and humiliated by what Dmitry was demanding from him and his friends. And I remember him saying to me on the phone, I don't need him because I have you. And I knew in that moment, like the fact that he came from a place where he could never have that level of faith and trust in the law enforcement officers that he interacted with day to day. But here, it was different. Here, he had that sort of faith and trust in our system. He knew that as a member of this esteemed institution, the FBI, that I would remain loyal to my oath and to those principles that my organization stands for, and I would actually help him. And we did, and that was why Felix was inclined when we asked him to go to a meeting to organize this racket wearing a concealed recording device. He didn't want to do it, he was scared, but he trusted us and he did it anyway. And that's why when he came out of that meeting and Dimitri said to him on the street, referring to a woman who owned a store who refused to pay, I want the woman beaten and I want her in the hospital for at least 2 weeks. And with that recording, we were able to make what turned out to be an unbelievable case. But it was experiences like that, working cases with people that we interacted with across every sector of life in this city, we saw the value and the strength that our own loyalty placed in the people that we worked with and how that translated into justice. I also had the chance at that time here in New York and of course later at headquarters to work for great leaders. Leaders who taught me about creating environments of trust within the people you lead. So my first leader here in New York was a guy named Ray Kerr. He was our squad supervisor. He was a legend in the New York City field office. And Ray would come in every morning around 8:30, and he was in the office until 8:30, 9:30, 10 o'clock every night. And the last few hours of every day, Ray would spend just talking to us about our cases, talking to us about our informants, listening to us complain about our prosecutors, which we did fairly frequently, but also talking to us about our wives and our kids and the renovations we were trying to do ourselves on our first houses and how do you put a deck on in the backyard. He was just there for us. He was a guy who connected with us on a very personal level, and he exemplified a level of excellence and honesty and integrity that we all aspired to mimic in our own lives in the way that we worked our own cases. Later, when I moved to headquarters, I had the opportunity to work very closely for many years with Director Mueller. So the best way I can describe Director Mueller to you is he is exactly the guy that you've heard about. He fits the description to a T. People have really got this guy figured out. He is the consummate investigator, the prosecutor, the cross-examiner. Director Mueller never met a case that he didn't love, and he wanted to get right down in the weeds of every one of them. And we'd use that knowledge to grill us at the table in the morning. He would ask us questions, constantly challenging our knowledge of the facts and whether or not we had followed up on the things that he'd asked us to do the day before. And although that was mildly terrifying and stressful at the time, I realized later, as a leader in the FBI, that what he was doing was teaching us and communicating the level of excellence, the level of understanding that he demanded of each of us. We're in a business with no margin. Preventing acts of terrorism, it's not like you can get most of them. You have to get them all. And understanding those demands, Director Mueller communicated to us exactly how much emphasis he placed on our expertise. But he's also incredibly fair-minded. And although he'd push you to the limit at the table, he was the same guy who called me the day after I got hit by a car riding my bike and called me to find out how I was doing. I was heavily on painkillers at the time, so it was a strange conversation that I cannot exactly recount at this moment. But another caring, moral leader with integrity who served as a great example to the people he led. So you can imagine My shock when on the evening of May 9th, 2017, after having been informed maybe a half an hour earlier by the Attorney General that he'd had to fire the FBI director, I received a call, my staff received a call and said, "The president would like to see you in the Oval Office." So I had never been to the Oval Office. I'd been to 1,000 meetings in the White House in the Situation Room with members of the National Security Council, some of which were attended by President Obama. But I had never met with a president in the Oval Office. So simply as a career government servant, going to the Oval Office is an awe-inspiring event, no matter who's sitting in the office at the time. When I walked in, President Trump was seated behind the Resolute desk, the incredible, solid, ornate, beautiful Resolute desk. And he popped up quickly, came around the desk with his hand outstretched and his fingers all stretched out at me, and immediately shook my hand and began talking. I know, you're surprised. President Trump is an overwhelming communicator. He's a big man. He speaks loudly and constantly. He launched into a tirade of really statements, not so much questions, just statements, which I later learned was his way of informing me of the facts that he wished me to adopt. He said, "I'm so glad you're here. This is going to be great. We got rid of Comey. Things are going to be great. Everybody's happy. Did you hear? Everybody's happy about this. I'm sure everybody's happy about it. Are you seeing that people are happy about it? Are they happy about this back at the FBI building? What do you think of that? Isn't it great? Isn't it terrific?" Fortunately, he did end with a question because I didn't really know how to respond to those assertions. And he said, "I heard you were part of the resistance." And totally caught me off guard. I said, "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir." And he said, "Well, I heard you were part of the group that didn't like Jim Comey. You didn't approve of what he did in these cases, and you didn't agree with him. You didn't agree with his decisions, and you objected to the way that he worked these cases. Is that right?" And I said, "No, sir, that's not right. I worked very closely with Jim Comey, and we worked on those cases together. I was a part of most of those decisions. I agreed with most of them. I know that some people have disagreements with the way that we handled some of our decisions, but I was a part of that team, and so I don't think you're correct about that." So in the moment, my impulse was simply to answer the question honestly, because that's what we do. It was only later that I realized that this was my loyalty test. Jim Comey had notoriously had his in his private dinner with the president shortly after his inauguration, where the president came right out and said, "I need you to be loyal." So there was no interpretation needed there. It was pretty direct. And I realized that this was my version of that same loyalty test. The president had clearly laid out the I don't want to call them facts, alternative facts that he wished I would adopt, and then gave me that opportunity, hung that lifeline in the water to say, you are either with us or against us. It didn't even occur to me at the time to respond to that in any way other than to correct his misimpression. So over the course of several other interactions with him, the next morning on the telephone, and then later that day in the afternoon, and in a follow-up meeting I had with him a few weeks later, I saw things about President Trump's leadership style that I had never seen in the FBI. I saw the way that his staff and advisors would sit at attention in a small row of chairs gathered in front of the Resolute desk. I saw the way that he and his advisors tried to manipulate me into inviting him to speak at the Hoover Building that week. I saw the way he reflexively, again and again, came back to references about my wife's failed political campaign in the state of Virginia in 2015, and consistently referred to it as that mistake that I made. Leaders don't. This was not a leader who was creating an environment of trust. These were obvious efforts to coerce me into a position to take that loyalty I'd had over the course of my career and shift it to loyalty to a person rather than to an ideal, rather than to the Constitution. We all know how this story plays out, unfortunately. Over the days that followed those meetings, I had the opportunity or the obligation to make a series of decisions of the cases that we were working that ultimately, I believe, was what led to my own firing from the FBI in some way. Those decisions have been characterized as acts of treason. And we have been referred, the group of us that worked on those issues have been referred to as plotting a coup to overturn the presidency. I think those words are lies. I think they are intentionally weaponized to gather people's attention to a certain set of talking points, to draw in viewers and listeners and clicks on the internet. But I'm going to leave it up to you. I'm going to tell you exactly what we thought, exactly what we knew at that time, and what we thought about the decisions we were making, and you can be the judge as to whether or not those decisions were an act of professional integrity and, in fact, loyalty that are the responsibilities we had at the time, or some sort of treasonous coup. So I'm going to ask you just for a minute to put on your investigator's hat and think about the facts that we had in our hands over the period leading up to the firing of Jim Comey and then immediately after. And keep in mind that the standard for opening an FBI case, as given to us by the Attorney General and the Attorney General guidelines, is when we have information, credible, articulable information to indicate that a threat to national security might exist or that a federal crime might have taken place. That is the standard to open a full field investigation, the most robust and capable level of investigative activity that we have. So go back in time through your investigator's lens, back to the fall of 2014. The fall of 2014 and then through 2015, we knew that the Russian government was behind an incredibly aggressive series of cyber attacks that were focused on institutions like government institutions in DC at the highest level, academic institutions, and also political think tanks. We weren't sure why they were doing it, but we knew that they were behind this activity. That gets us through 2014 and 2015. Into 2016, we see the aggression and the targeting of that activity becomes even more specific. We then uncover signs that the Democratic National Committee may be a target of this malign Russian cyber activity. And we go through a period of fits and starts where we don't communicate very well with the DNC and telling them that they should check their systems and see if they see actual evidence of this sort of probing and intelligence collection that we know the adversary engages in. Then as we get deeper into 2016, we see that activity is focused specifically on emails at the DNC and in other places associated with Hillary Clinton and her campaign. Unbeknownst to us, in May of 2016, an individual with the Trump campaign named George Papadopoulos has a meeting with a friendly foreign diplomat in which he tells that diplomat that the Russians have informed them that they have a lot of negative information about candidate Clinton, and they offered to help the campaign with using that information. But we don't know this in May. So when you get into June and July and what happens? Now we see the information we know the Russians have taken is actually weaponized. It's released on the eve of the convention in an effort to harm candidate Clinton. Seeing that activity, the friendly foreign diplomat realizes the significance of the information he has received from Mr. Papadopoulos, and he then passes that to us. So at the end of July in 2016, we've known for a while that the Russians have been targeting our political systems. We know they're doing it through cyber means. We know they've taken this information from the democratic infrastructure. They used it against candidate Clinton. And now we know from someone in the campaign that they were at least aware of the fact that the Russians had this information and were willing to make it available. So the obvious question for us then is it possible? Do we now have information that our most significant adversary on the world stage might be working in concert with a domestic political campaign to undermine the stability and sanctity of our democratic elections? We make that decision to open the Russia case for that reason. We open the case, and then we think, okay, now who are we actually going to investigate? That's a good question. Who do we know who's associated with the campaign who has known significant ties to Russian intelligence? We quickly come up with 4 names that will not surprise you. Mr. Papadopoulos, because he's the guy who made the statement. Paul Manafort, who's well known before that time to have had high-level contacts with political contacts in the Ukraine, with candidates who are supported by Russia. Michael Flynn, simply because he had engaged in some very high-level and very public interactions with Vladimir Putin and other Russians. And an individual named Carter Page. Carter Page was a guy who is known to us for many years, had come up in an earlier counterintelligence case, who'd actually been interviewed and alerted by our agents to the concerns we had about the people he was interacting with, and who then went and shared that information with them after the briefing. So Carter was a person who had significant former contacts with Russian intelligence agents. So the 4 cases were open on that basis. And what happens as we go into the fall? So the intelligence community comes together and produces the Intelligence Community Assessment, the ICA, which concludes unanimously across our 3 agencies, the NSA, CIA, and FBI, that the Russians intentionally meddled in the campaign. President Trump is inaugurated in January, and he begins a series of odd and concerning interactions with Director Comey, in which he requests a pledge of loyalty, in which he repeatedly requests that we make a public statement that he's not under investigation, and demands that we lift the cloud from over his investigation. These are all concerning us. And then he asks us to close the investigation into Mike Flynn. And that, for me personally, was a bit of a Rubicon that we had crossed. Up until that point, we're never quite sure, are these odd interactions and requests just the act of someone who doesn't really understand the intricacies and the sensitivity of the White House FBI relationship? But with the request to close the Flynn investigation, it became clear to us that he does not like the fact that we are investigating Russian involvement in that campaign. And then, of course, in May, President Trump fires Director Comey. And after he fired, in the day before that's made final, he asks the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, to write a memo justifying the firing. And he asks the Deputy Attorney General to please put Russia in your memo. And the Deputy Attorney General says, I don't think that's a good idea. And he says, I understand you feel that way, but I'm asking you to do it anyway. After he fires the director, he tells Lester Holt on the news that when he fired the director, he was thinking about Russia. And then the next day, he tells the Russians that he fired the director, and doing so had relieved a lot of pressure from the Russia investigation. So with that knowledge, and your investigator hats are all tightly pulled down over your heads here. I see you're all considering this closely. Ask yourself, have we met the standard for an investigation? Do we have information that might indicate that a threat to national security could exist or that a federal crime could have been committed? That was the question that confronted me on May 9th and in the days following, when we ultimately determined to open a case on the President of the United States. act of treason? The plotting of a coup against the United States of America? I think not. What it was us doing our job. We are the investigators. We are not the prosecutors. We are not the judge. We opened the case because we clearly had the facts to predicate it. We didn't do it because we thought it would be cool or fun or interesting. We didn't do it because we wanted to help one side or hurt the other side. We did it simply because it was our responsibility to do so. And we take that responsibility incredibly seriously. To not do so under those circumstances would have been a dereliction of duty, would have been a failure in the loyalty we had all pledged to that Constitution. To fail to act at that time because the person involved was the President of the United States would have been even worse. We would have been undermining the bedrock assumption that all people in this country, none of them are above the law, including the President. So we remained loyal to that oath, to that responsibility, and to our commitment to treat everyone the same under the law. So here we are, 2 years later, and we are still struggling with these same concepts. We still hear words like deep state or treason or plotting coups. The frustrating thing for me in the way that our work has been, I think, unfairly criticized is that it also vilifies the good work of men and women who are devoted to the service of this country. And by doing so, it dishonors their commitment and the value they bring to all of our lives. I worry about our ability to continue to attract the best and brightest to lives in public service. I worry about those colleagues, former colleagues of mine who continue to serve in government and who have to confront the questions, the same sort of questions that we did. Do you stand up, stand for the things you believe in, and speak out? And if by doing so, you run the risk of being publicly scorned by the President of the United States, or maybe even being fired 26 hours before you achieve your pension. So, to you, concerned citizens, politically aware people who care about your community, who care about these sort of issues, my only request is that in any way that you can, you stand up. Stand up for the things you believe in. Speak out about the things that you see that are wrong. Do it even when it's hard. Do it even when it could hurt you personally. After everything I've been through in the last 2 years, I stand here before you battered but not broken. And I can honestly tell you, if taken back to those times, I'd make every decision the same way again tomorrow. It's worth it. It's worth it for the men and women who are serving today. It's worth it for the whistleblower who stepped up in the last week and a half and kind of thrust us into the current controversy that we're all thinking about. That is the way out of a time when concepts like loyalty have been destroyed and disfigured into pledges of personal loyalty. We get back from this time by focusing on those things that unite us, that commitment to the Constitution, and the beautiful concepts that it embodies for every American. So thank you very much for listening, and I will now ask Mr. Bernstein to come join me on the stage.
That was extraordinary to hear.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. This is a terrific book.
Thank you.
That you've written. It's an extraordinary tale about a person's journey through national service and where that national service is broken down, among others, and also about where we are in the country today. I think there's a lot to learn in here. And in what you've just touched on, it's raised a number of both specific and general questions that I would like to ask you. But let's start with the first. Given what we've seen of the temperament of the President of the United States in the last week, what's not in your book, I believe, is a discussion you were present at about the invocation of the 25th Amendment. What provoked that discussion? Who had it? And tell us about it.
Sure.
Set the scene a bit.
So in the days following Jim's firing, I had a series of meetings with the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. First, in a one-on-one exchange on the Friday of that week, so I think that would have been the 12th, and then over the days that followed in slightly larger groups of people. Oh, never particularly big. It was in one of those first meetings that Rod raised the idea of the 25th Amendment in the course of a wild and chaotic conversation about what the president had done and what he may have been thinking when he did it. Like,
What the president had done specifically, when and where.
so like around the issue
What
of...
provoked it?
So Rod and I were discussing, of course, the firing of Jim Comey and why Jim had been fired, and whether or not the president was, there was more to it essentially than the reasons that Rod had memorialized in his memo. And so it's in the course of that conversation that Rod first offered to wear a wire into the White House.
Do you remember his words?
I do remember him saying that pointing out the fact that he didn't get searched when he went into the West Wing, and so therefore he felt he could wear a recording device and that no one would know he had it.
So there could be nothing to the story, given your description, that this was some kind of joke he was making.
That absolutely was not a joke.
Okay.
No, and in fact, he raised it in front of others in later meetings, and so pointed out to people that he had made this offer to me. I, of course, thought it was an unbelievably bad idea. I kind of put the whole thing aside by saying, well, I'll talk to the investigative team, and if that's something they want to do, then I'll come back to you and ask you for that authority. And of course, we never did. I remember going back and telling my team back at FBI headquarters, which included the general counsel, was Jim Baker, and some other senior leaders who were working the case. I said, you're not going to believe this, but the Deputy Attorney General offered to wire up into the White House. And the FBI's lawyer, Jim Baker, who's a wonderful guy and a very good lawyer, but also has a tendency to be a little bit stressed out. He was like, "Oh my God, you're not doing that. You're not doing it." And I was like, "I'm not asking you, Jim. I'm just telling you the story for comic effect." But no, it's not something we ever consider doing. And similarly, Rod's comments about the 25th Amendment and whether or not the president was kind of capable, and who would be inclined to support such an effort was really, I never considered it seriously in any way. So first of all, it's not a process that the acting director of the FBI would have any role in.
Who was in that discussion about the 25th Amendment?
So Rod brought it up, probably not in our first meeting, but in a second and maybe third meeting. So this is a very small group of people, myself, his chief of staff, another woman from his staff, and then in the third meeting would have been one or two other people.
And the reason for its invocation being the firing itself? Or some temperamental?
It's hard for me to say exactly, Carl. I can't really fully describe for you how stressful the time was. And that stress was really having a deep impact on Mr. Rosenstein. And the conversations we had were kind of freewheeling off the top of his head comments. Sometimes we would go from discussing one person to another person, and it wasn't entirely clear to me whether he was referring to someone as a possible candidate for the special counsel role or referring to someone as a possible candidate for the director's job. It was a very chaotic and emotional exchange.
But it did not go to a question about the president's stability?
No, it was more like Rod was kind of musing off the top of his head about who would support such an effort. Who else would think that the president
Because you have to do it through the cabinet.
That's right.
And,
That's right. So he kind of
and you talked about those chairs lined up in front of the Resolute desk, and I'm just sitting there thinking about Wilbur Ross saying, "Oh yeah, that's an idea. Let's do the 25th Amendment on this guy."
Yeah. Yeah, it's not something that ever turned into an actual effort, as far as I'm aware. It was an offhanded mention, one that I didn't even include in my own book, and for that reason.
There's been a lot of talk by the President of the United States, by those around him, by the Attorney General of the United States, about a deep state.
Yeah.
And some kind of deep state plot that really it's not the Russians who are behind everything, but rather there's something deeper here that goes to others, goes to the Democrats, goes who knows where it goes. And yet, isn't there a real history in the institution that you worked for, in the CIA, not that long ago, evidence of a real and dangerous deep state in terms of that existed under FBI Director Hoover, in the committees of Congress, that House Un-American Activities Committee, Senate Internal Security Committee, the CIA in its spying on, breaking into people's premises who were under suspicion. So when did this deep state cease to exist, if you accept, and do you accept, that the FBI at one point was part of something that might be called a deep state?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't propose to define the concept, but I will absolutely say that in the course of the FBI's history, when you look back on the FBI's intelligence program, there were decades of illegal activity, activity that, quite frankly, was an embarrassment to the institution and to the nation, and should never have taken place. Our history, and particularly on the intel side, is checkered at best. But the defining moment was truly, the Church Commission hearings, the efforts of people like, Bobby Kennedy and others who confronted this thing head on and ultimately brought the FBI to the place it is today. And I would suggest that the FBI that most people know and expect is the post-Hoover FBI that we all have experienced.
You came in '96.
I did, yeah.
And these types of activities you saw nothing of, they were done by the time you got there.
Now look, there are certainly activities that the FBI engages in that some people don't approve of.
Well, sure.
And don't support. But they are nevertheless lawful and closely scrutinized by the courts and Congress. So that FBI of old, where Hoover basically, cut political deals with enemies and foes alike and used the agency essentially to the aggregation of his own power, is not the FBI that I know.
The Mueller investigation, did the final report itself fall short of the maximum use of what information was developed by the FBI and other investigators? And was there something in the way that the report was written or assembled that accounts for what I and other reporters were told a few weeks before the report was released, and the quote that I was given was that FBI senior officials and prosecutors under Mr. Mueller were demoralized by the final stages of the process and by what was going into the report. Were you aware of that? And talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I can't speak to the morale of the team because I have not been connected with those folks since I left the Bureau. I've heard those same reports, but I can't say how accurate that is. As far as the report goes, from my personal perspective, I was both kind of amazed and impressed by some aspects of it, and then a little disappointed by other aspects as well. I think much in the same way many folks who really read it and dug into it.
What disappointed you? And did Mr. Mueller's performance before Congress disappoint you?
Well,
I can take them one at a time.
Yeah, sure. So the report,
stack them up a little bit.
When I read the report, particularly volume 2 about obstruction, that to me is very much the product of Bob Mueller. Not that he sat down and wrote the whole thing by himself, but what comes out of that volume is Bob Mueller's sense of fairness and propriety. And Bob Mueller, I think, went as far as he possibly could to essentially call every ball in the air in the president's favor. And despite that, in a report that details 10 separate categories of obstructive behavior, I think in 8 of those 10 categories, he finds that the president's behavior has essentially satisfied all the elements of the offense of obstruction of justice. And we knew that he limited himself he followed assiduously the DOJ policy that a sitting president cannot be indicted, and then in his own sense of fairness, decided that it would also be improper to say that anyone else who had committed these acts would likely be charged with obstruction of justice.
You know, Jaworski did the same thing also in the Nixon investigation. Jaworski also did not specifically accuse Nixon. He gave a roadmap.
Right.
Is that what Mueller did?
I believe it is. Unfortunately, the roadmap is incredibly dense, tough to follow. And so when you lose the opportunity to kind of deliver that final conclusion, you lose a lot of the audience. And so in an effort that essentially, what happens with that report is based in some extent on how strongly people feel about it, you miss out on the opportunity to kind of show folks how substantive it is. You've got to really wade through that thing with a lawyer's eye for detail or an investigator's eye for detail to appreciate it. And I think it's unfortunate, most people are they don't have the time or interest to do that.
There's nothing in the report, as I recall, that talks about any significant communications between Paul Manafort and Donald Trump, the candidate. Mm-hmm. Did you or were you aware of any such communications that bore on the investigation that you undertook and it might not have been put in the report? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
I do know, but I can't tell you. I'm kidding. So we,
Try to make a little news.
So, you got to remember, we handed off those cases at a very kind of early stage. So I was not aware of any information like that at the time we handed the cases off to the special counsel. And I don't know what they found or what they chose to put in or what they chose to leave out.
But you never saw any information whatsoever in a 302 or anything else that would have any bearing on conversations or communications between Manafort and the candidate?
I'll phrase it differently. I am not aware of any information that I think should have been given greater consideration and wasn't.
Okay. You were among those supervising the Hillary Clinton server
That's right.
investigation. Did she undermine the national security of the United States in her installation and use of that server?
I've been asked a lot of questions about that case, but not that one. So good on you. Look, I think that the entire staff infrastructure, so it's not just Secretary Clinton, but her close associates and advisors and those communicants who are interacting with her over the email, every day, They were just the simple fact that they were doing so over architecture that didn't carry the United States government's typical level of cybersecurity protections. That is dangerous activity.
So was it negligent? Was it dangerous?
I'm not going to relitigate the legal call.
I don't mean in a legal sense, actually.
But it was irresponsible. Irresponsible, I think. Now, there are many reasons why they did that. They were hampered by particularly poor systems at the department. There were folks in that circle of communicants who were not particularly tech savvy. They were operating under kind of intense demands. I am absolutely confident in our conclusion that none of them, the secretary or any of her associates, engaged in that behavior intentionally to violate the statute or to conceal or mishandle classified information. I don't believe they were...
Or to keep it from any possible eyes that might use it nefariously, like the vast right-wing conspiracy?
No, that was our conclusion in the case, that ultimately, at the end of the day, did we find a lot of misuse of the email? Yes, but we didn't find any evidence that it was done intentionally. And without that element of intent, you cannot prove the offense, and therefore we recommended that justice not go further.
During the campaign before Trump was nominated, did you think that by and large the press coverage of Hillary Clinton's server was unfair to her?
I don't know that I thought about it in terms of whether the press coverage was fair or unfair, but it was certainly a constant pressure on the work that we were doing. I often get asked, like, why did you handle the cases differently? Why, when you opened the case against the Trump campaign, to investigate possibly working with the Russians, you did that quietly, you did that covertly, and so forth. But the Clinton case was wide open. You have to understand that the Clinton case was public before we got it. The very referrals that we received from the state and ICIG that initiated the FBI investigation were public. The director and the attorney general, soon after we opened the case, publicly acknowledged it. So that public nature of the case drove a ton of that reporting that you're referring to. So not only was what we were doing already public, the relentless reporting around every little issue really elevated the pressure to get that job done in a way that if we could, before it would have an impact on the campaign. Obviously, that's not how things ended up, but...
Mr. Barr, the Attorney General, has been on a worldwide search for what he apparently believes or wants to believe is this deep state conspiracy within the intelligence community and the Obama administration as the impetus for your investigation of the Russian interference in the campaign. And you said on CNN this week that the circumstances, and you described them, are not a mystery, and that you've touched on the issues in the book, and you've told us a little bit about it here. But what else about the instigation of the investigation haven't you told us? And I think there's something.
That's why you're a great reporter.
Tell us.
Never satisfied with what is already known.
Tell us a little bit about what you might make your answer a little more fulsome.
Well, I can't, Carl. As we walk through during my comments here tonight, that is basically what we knew. I mean, we knew more detail about Russian cyber activity, and we knew more technical detail about what they were doing and how they were doing it. But those are, of course, details that I cannot share. But essentially, You
haven't left anything big out.
No. The exercise that we went through, I do this specifically because people should understand that the FBI, number one, The FBI doesn't just open cases because we think like, hey, that's neat, or it'll get a lot of press or something like that. We open cases when, under our authority, we think it's required to do so. That's called, that threshold level of information is what you hear referred to as predication for a case. Under these circumstances, we so clearly had the predication to initiate these investigations that not doing so would have just been turning a blind eye to our responsibilities. There isn't a mystery behind it of more facts or the secret information or something that we got from Malta via
Obviously,
Sri
from
Lanka.
what afterwards was reported by the press, it was justified. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like a 2-year special counsel investigation resulted in what? 36 indictments, numerous convictions,
Russians,
the volume 1 of the report that lays out in detail exactly what the Russians did. So the results of the special counsel's efforts, no matter how anticlimactic one might think they are, validated our concerns in July of 2016 and May of 2017.
And my reading of the Mueller report actually is that there's a good deal there about, not forget about the obstruction part of it, about the actual contacts between Russians and aspects of the Trump campaign.
The level of detail
that
they put in that report was extraordinary to me. As an intelligence officer, they exposed a level of detail about different Russian intelligence agencies and how they work and what they do that was remarkable. So if you're into that sort of thing, if you're in the small geek world like me, then you should definitely
question about the instigation of the investigation, the Steele dossier. Mm-hmm. What role did or did it not play? And what's your evaluation of what it is and represents and its accuracy, or is it really intended to be a raw intelligence document, some false, some misinformation, some disinformation, some from good sources, some from bad sources? What is it, and what was its role in the instigation?
Okay, so first, it had no role in the initiation of the Russia investigation. We didn't even have it. The Russia investigation was opened on July 30th, I think, and we didn't even get the dossier in our hands until, I want to say, mid to late September. So it played no role in the opening, the initial opening of the case.
Now that's contrary, I believe, to what some people around the president have maintained. Is that right?
I'm quite sure it is. Yeah, I'm quite sure it is.
Okay.
It did play a role in our pursuit of a warrant from the FISA court to initiate electronic surveillance on Carter Page.
Right.
It was not the sum total of that request for FISA authority. It was part of some of the information that was in that package, but not all of it. I have been many times misquoted from closed testimony that I gave on the Hill. So it's easy to quote someone from testimony that's not been released. That's frustrating. That we would not have gotten the FISA warrant without the Steele dossier. That is not and has never been my position. What I have said is it is impossible now, having sent the request in with the Steele dossier and all the other information about Carter Page, it is impossible for anyone to say, well, could you have gotten it without that? Well, it was in there. I can't take it out retroactively.
Were there, though, in the dossier itself, in those 40 or whatever the number of paragraphs, were there some good leads?
Yes. Yes, there was a lot of information that we could not disprove. There was a fair amount of information. I
want to repeat that. A lot of information that you could not disprove.
That's right. There was a fair amount of information that we knew was accurate, but there are always questions with respect to timing.
Right.
Right. So when you get reporting from a source, you have to determine, even if what the source is telling you is correct, you have to figure out, is there some other way he may have come across this information other than the way that he's representing?
My reading of it, and tell me if this seems right to you, and I spent a good deal of time with it, obviously, from the beginning, was that Steele didn't pretend that the information was definitive, that rather they were from sources, and he was outside Russia himself, but he had old
right.
sources from when he was inside Russia, that he could communicate with some of them outside and some through intermediaries with people who were still inside.
That's right.
And there are varying levels of which there is both plausibility, perhaps accuracy, but that it was not intended to be a definitive document.
You're absolutely right.
Is that,
It is raw source reporting.
it's the kind of thing you would do?
Steele presented it as such. It's the kind of thing we see often from sources. And we knew that Steele was working a number of different sources, some of which had sub-sources and sub-sub-sources, and he would represent that in the reporting, as any good source should. So it didn't come with his imprimatur of this is all gospel. It was like, this is what I'm hearing. And that's how good sources report. A lot of the information, some of the information was consistent with reporting we were getting from other sources. So that's always to his credit. Steele had a history of good reporting to us. He had provided information on other cases about Russian organized crime issues and other issues, information that was judged to be so accurate that it was used in things like arrest warrants and indictments. So he had a very solid track record and provided this information with, accurately describing. Some of it he thought was pretty solid. Others he made clear, hey, I'm getting this from one person and I can't vouch for the sourcing chain, and I'm just giving it to you for your information.
Let's give people in the audience a chance to ask questions. We've got microphones on either side here, so why don't you come up here and a few of you line up. And meanwhile, I'll call on somebody in the first row with a question and I'll repeat it. Go ahead, while others line up. Hello, Bob. This is Bob Kuttner, a great journalist and now publisher. Go to the mic.
So, this is something I've never quite understood, and it's an honor to be in the same room with you.
Thank you.
If you're getting this info, this intel in 15 and early 16 about the Russians engaging in all kinds of cyber warfare, was this transmitted to the President of the United States? This is Obama's president. You've got serious people running the CIA, the NSA, and I would assume that if you were getting this kind of intelligence, it would have been appropriate for Obama to go to Putin and say, you better cut this out or really bad stuff is going to happen. So did that happen? If it didn't, is that because that's not how the FBI works, or what?
And let me add to the question, did Secretary Clinton convey anything like that to the Russians?
Well, she would not have been there in 15. When did? Yeah, Kerry.
Oh, you're talking, okay.
Yeah, he's talking about in 15. So, well, first of all, that was information that was known across the intelligence community. So there's no question that people were aware of what was going on. But your question gets right to the heart of an issue that we still struggle with, and that is, how does the intelligence community handle highly sensitive intelligence about cyber activity if you go forward and make the sort of warnings or threats or indications to your adversary that you know what's going on, they very quickly move to a different set of infrastructure, move to a different threat vector, and you lose the visibility on the threat. And so it's not dissimilar to the question that you're always struggling with human sources. When a human source gives you information, if I then immediately turn around and use it in a search warrant or an indictment, I run the risk of burning that human source, and they're no longer valuable. So it's that same sort of concern in the cyber realm is even more sensitive and a little bit harder to grapple with. I can't sit here and tell you what President Obama was briefed on personally.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. My name is Prabhakaran, an alumnus of the New School. I have a two-part question. The first part relates to the famous or infamous DOJ principle that a sitting president cannot be indicted. The prodigious work done by Robert Mueller came to naught because of that principle. It's a waste of resources and time. That second part is,
What is the question, though?
question is there anything we can do about it? This is in conflict with the high principle, the great principle the country has been following from the beginning, that nobody is above the law. We heard it repeated ad nauseum, didn't we? Mm-hmm. Nobody is above the law.
You want to try and answer it?
Sure. So
I'll give it a shot afterwards. But
it is a policy of the Department of Justice. It's not law. And it is a policy based on the Department of Justice lawyers' interpretation of the Constitution. And they feel it would be unconstitutional to indict a sitting president because it essentially, all the effort and time and attention that it would take the president to defend himself personally is essentially you are taking that resource away from the country that elected him. I'm not saying I agree with their interpretation, but that's what the principle is based on.
And it goes back to the Nixon. The same decision was made in the Nixon impeachment.
It could be rescinded by the Department of Justice
Exactly.
if their interpretation changed, but I think that's unlikely.
Discard that policy.
And that's
The second
why
part is-
Nixon.
Yes, sir.
We're going to just do one point, I think, to give other people
Yeah,
a
second
chance.
part is a very small question. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, it has to do with the mental state of the present president. A man who changes...
Question.
The man who changes his opinion faster than a chameleon changes its color. Something has wrong here.
Question.
So, can we forcibly subject him to a psychiatric evaluation?
I think I'll take that one.
No.
We're in
I
agreement.
don't think you can. I don't think you can.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear it?
Yes, you're good now.
You gave a very impressive presentation. I have complete confidence in what you have to say.
Thank you.
I ask you this question. How concerned are you for our future? Where are we heading? How dangerous is the situation that we are in? What is your sense about where we are heading?
So I am absolutely optimistic about our future and the future of this nation. We are stronger than the times we are in right now. We have been through worse crises in this country before. We've gotten through those crises by rallying around those things that bind us together, that understanding that we all want to live in some place that's free and fair and just. We have drifted from that at the moment. We've got some tough situations to get through before we get back to appreciating each other and where we are on that level. But I have absolutely no doubt that we will get back to that time. What it's going to take is ethical, transparent leadership that is truly dedicated to uniting this country and observing the rule of law.
Thank you.
Behind you.
Thank you for the lecture. It was wonderful. The theme of this lecture is loyalty, and I have a question about Attorney General Barr. It's a two-parter, but I'll keep it short. First off, why do you think that AG Barr is acting in the interest of the president instead of taking on the traditionally more impartial position, as AG and DOJ is usually separate from the president? And what do you think that Barr's actions mean for the future of the Department of Justice after Trump?
Yeah, great questions. I think the first one I really can't answer. It wouldn't be fair for me to speculate on why he's doing what he's doing. I think it's more important to focus on the things that he's actually doing and what a departure this is from attorneys general that we have seen over the last several series of attorneys general. There is no question that his efforts, certainly in the revelations of the last week of traveling around the world and pursuing this investigation of the investigators, is completely consistent with the president's preferred political narrative. And so I think things like that are ultimately harmful to the reputation of the department. Again, I think it won't be fatal to the department, but we have got to get back to a position where we all have faith that the leadership of the Department of Justice is acting on the law and on the facts and not on politics.
Do you have suggestions or ideas? Or maybe, do you want to apply for the next one?
I don't think they're going to ask me, but they know where I live, so they can find me.
I would just point out that there is a bit of mythology about the independence of the attorneys general.
Sure,
And you go back to Watergate and remember that two of Nixon's attorneys general were implicated in Watergate, one of whom went to jail for a considerable time. And yes.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for being an amazing role model of integrity. We need that. So it seems that there's been irreparable damage to our ability to gather intelligence, and ways of gathering intelligence for decades have been kind of lost. Do you feel there's been irreparable damage to any of our kind of methods by exposing people and methodology? And do you think that's training people that loyalty is underrated?
Well, I think that the damage that's being done to the intelligence community right now I don't think it's irreparable. I think my guess is it's more on the human side than it is on the technical side. People in the community dedicate their lives to doing hard and stressful and dangerous, oftentimes, work for the sole purpose of providing information and insights to the decision makers, and ultimately to the ultimate decision maker, the President of the United States. So when they get back these consistent messages that the President doesn't trust them, the President doesn't use the information that they're sending, the President isn't interested in educating himself about the issues of greatest concern, that is incredibly dispiriting to those people. My hope is that they are hanging on through this hard time, and that when they once again work for a leader who appreciates and values their contribution, that they'll be able to bounce right back to the high level of performance they've always delivered. So I hope that people aren't so discouraged that they're leaving the community. But again, I'm optimistic for our ability to turn that around.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Olivia Cadwell, and I'm a first-year PhD student here at the New School. Thank you both for being here.
Sure.
I have a one-part question, and that question is your perspective, specifically more on the divisiveness of this nation, staying on the topic of loyalty and betrayal. What would you say to the people, to the American people specifically, who are calling this whistleblower a treasonist, or actually someone who's betraying this country?
Yeah, it's so incredibly damaging and really impacts me personally, because I've been the subject of those same sort of lies. And as someone who spent my career serving the country, there's really, to be called a liar and guilty of treason is about as bad as it possibly gets. Look, and I'll say full disclosure, as somebody who ran an or an executive branch agency, whistleblowers are like, not a happy day when you find out there's been another whistleblower report out of your agency. Nobody likes that, but we all understand and respect the essential role that whistleblowers play in keeping us a highly functioning and accountable organization, right? So that report might expose all kinds of problems that you as a leader then have to deal with, and that can be inconvenient or embarrassing or what have you. But it is the way that we address fraud, waste, and abuse and violations of law, things that have escaped the traditional routes of oversight. So it's absolutely essential that people feel comfortable if they are courageous enough and willing to step up and speak up, that we have a legal regime set up that will protect them and will provide for a fair and unbiased vetting of their complaints. So when the President of the United States attacks the whistleblower in complete contravention of the whistleblower statute, which is one of the laws that he has sworn an oath the C is faithfully executed, so there's a little conflict there. It's incredibly damaging, and I'm sure it's terrifying to that person, which is unfortunate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Bernstein raised the question about Mueller's testimony before Congress, but then the discussion veered away from that, so I'm raising the question again. Don't you think that Mueller, who was characterized as a patriot, should he not have been more explicit, more outspoken in informing the American public about what he had learned in the investigation?
Well, I'll say this. As a viewer, I would have preferred a more dynamic presentation. But as someone who worked very closely with Director Mueller, I understand that what we saw was an incredibly cautious Bob Mueller. Director Mueller clearly did not want to, didn't trust the questions and the way he'd be pushed by either side in the hearing, didn't want to be perceived as favoring one side over the other. And his way of ensuring that he didn't do that was he would not stray one comma, one period, one word from the text of the report. And so that he backed himself into a corner where he wouldn't provide any answers beyond the report. And I think that ultimately undermined the appeal and the effectiveness of the testimony.
He could have repeated many of the statements in the report to make it better known to the public that didn't read it.
Yeah, the whole thing just didn't come off as, you do the testimony knowing that most people are not going to read the 400-page report. So you put the testimony on so people have a more accessible way to understand what's there. I'm not sure that they accomplished that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's be honest, these are not normal times. This is straight up fascism. And we're seeing this, there's the evidence, it's there. And, the rule of law can only mean something if something's actually done about what's happening. So I just want to say, I have two questions.
One question.
One,
I'm afraid
okay,
we only
I can
got
read
time.
okay, whatever. Let me read my question. If you will not take to the streets now to demand the Trump-Pence regime must go, what will you do if Trump is reelected? Perhaps through the Electoral College, even if he loses the popular vote. And what will you do if Trump loses the election, even with the Electoral College count, but then refuses to recognize the results and insists he is still president?
We're going to make that the last question, and I'm going to let Andrew, I'm going to let you go to town on that.
You couldn't have cut it off one earlier.
No, but
Look,
it's a serious question.
Look, I totally understand your frustration. And so a couple things. One, I think the thing to do now, if you feel that way, is to get involved in the process, to get out there and support the candidates and the people who you think best represent you and your community in this country. And that's not just saying okay, yeah, I think I'll go to the polls. That obviously you have to do, but get out there and work for the people that you believe in. The best way to turn this thing over is through the process. I don't really know what kind of taking it to the streets means. I don't know how we accomplish productive change out of that. Ultimately, you have to convince people to get off their butts, go to the ballot box, and vote for those leaders who you have some faith in. As far as this concern that you hear voiced pretty frequently now about whether or not the president will accept the result if he loses in 2020 or whenever, I don't really worry about that. I don't think he'll be happy about it. It probably won't be a cordial departure. But we have systems and processes and authority in this country.
That he's been shredding. He's actually been shredding the rule of law ever since he's been in office. So what about that?
I get that. I understand what you're saying, but I guess I'm just not willing to kind of throw in the towel on that yet. And we maybe see it differently, and that's okay too. But I do think when the time comes, It's going to be chaotic and uncomfortable, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the peaceful transition of power is something that's been happening in this country for 240 whatever years, and I have faith in our ability to make that happen again under any circumstances.
I'd like to thank, first of all, the audience, but also for your extraordinary presentation.
Thank you.
And for letting us in on some things we didn't know about.
And thank you to you for agreeing to do this.
Thank you.
Wonderful
That was
questions.
great. Thank you.
It's awesome.